But we're now to our story behind the story segment where we talk about our guests, their creative endeavors, what they're currently working on. Jason, you write military sci-fi. You're speaking my language. As you can see, I have some artwork from some of my book covers here behind me in case you
Oh,
can't see
very
them.
nice. Yeah, absolutely.
So we're in the same sort of genre. What inspired you to write the Hammerhead series? What's the inspiration behind it?
Absolutely. So I've been a sci-fi fan since I started reading. I just remember like I remember going to Powell's bookstore in Portland, buying I've saved up my money and I bought every Arthur C. Clarke book I could get. I love the old school sci-fi, and I actually didn't know military sci-fi. I didn't really identify that what I was writing was military sci-fi. What I had done when I
Mm-hmm.
wrote my first book was I took a short story and I flipped the ending of it. So in the end of that whole setup, he actually turns the woman over, excuse me, to the people that come hunting for her, and then he goes home to his wife. Is like, yeah, I think I made a mistake today, and it was kind of a tragic short story. And when I thought, I really want to dig into my first book for real, I want to jump in on this. I'm like, hey, let's take that short story and flip the ending and see what happens, because I wanted a short time span with a small cast that was super high action, just so it was less for me to mess up. And it happened to
Yeah.
have that militarized background. And then people started emailing like, oh, what happens next? What's the sequel going to be? And because it had hit the bestseller, so I started getting emails from people. And I was like, I never planned a sequel. So I started writing a sequel to it. And that one, fortunately, has done well, as has the third. Um, so I'm not necessarily a military sci-fi reader, but the reason it did well for me was because I was steeped in reality. And I think that's really important. Whatever genre you're going to be writing, and you should be reading that genre, but you should also be reading real accounts of people who've lived that life. So if you're not
Mm-hmm.
reading nonfiction accounts of naval battles, if you're writing military sci-fi, you really need to do that, because there's an authenticity that pervades your work once you've taken in some of that information. That's really, really critical.
Yeah, I know myself. Haven't served in the armed forces. Great respect.
Same,
Have
same.
many family members who have served, both in my extended family and so forth. However, what I have found really useful are interviews with veterans on YouTube, getting to see firsthand, and there's, depending on which generation, like which war they fought in as well, you get a totally different story and a totally different outlook in terms of like their response to it and so forth. I found that helpful. But yeah, maybe if you have somebody you can talk to, or at the very least, watching documentaries, I agree. If you're in that genre and that's not part of your background, that's something that you need to do, because those veterans who read your stuff, they'll call you on it.
Mhm.
They'll be
Oh,
like,
yeah.
My
Real
uh,
fast.
my
you know, yeah, like,
yeah, my
well,
husband's a
that's
veteran and he's not there's like a lot of times if he's walking in uniform and somebody thanks him for his service, he actually gets really uncomfortable. He doesn't It's one of those things he doesn't really like.
sure,
And it's one of those things that like you don't know that if you aren't that in that life, you think, that's something that they, enjoy, but I think it's more of it, like he feels called out, or like it makes him a
sure,
little uncomfortable. So yeah, he's still in the military. And yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing.
right, right. Well,
Yeah.
and with sci-fi, you can maybe fudge it a little bit, because like different setting, in my case, totally imagined worlds and
Yeah. I
factions
think
as
that
well. I'm not dealing with the real world setting as a backdrop, so you can fudge some things here and there. um, as far as those things are concerned. But overall, the experience of being in the military is something that is sometimes hard to capture.
Mhm.
I think I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but
Well, I think it's really interesting what you mentioned is whatever we're dealing with is if you're writing a story from a perspective of somebody who's in a royal court, like they're at the top of the echelon socially, or you're doing a thing like the Firefly stuff where you're on the edges and the fringes of society, perspectives are going to be very different, attitudes are very different. So if you're talking about like a World War II scenario where the combatants had horrible experiences, but they perceived their actions as salvation, like they did something really important. Or you go to
Mhm.
over a situation where a lot of vets in Vietnam felt that everything they did was futile, and when they came home, they were often derided. The whole experience is going to be a completely different thing. So it's really important to see those things and then think to yourself, okay, well, what is it I'm doing here and how are people really going to act? Well, I read that one story about the Korean War that was really informative about that. Or I read that story about courts in England and now I know, okay. And you can see that when you go to the White Tower. I swear, I don't know if it's true, but I was in the White Tower in England looking at all the historical documents and there's this piece of armor that's like the smallest piece of armor and it was a small person. And then there's the biggest dude. And I was looking at it, I'm like, that looks like Tyrion Lannister and the Mountain That Rides. And I wondered if George R. R. Martin stood in that same space and came up with those characters then through true historical connection. I know that he had a lot of stuff he did like
Yep.
that. So steeping
Yeah.
yourself in reality is great.
I was just thinking a lot of it about the Game of Thrones is a lot about the War of the Roses, actually,
Yeah.
from
Yes.
the Tudor time.
You're making me think about the book I'm releasing at the end of the month because I write high fantasy romantic subplot. My heroine, she's 400 years old and she's a general, and she's at the point. My dad was a Vietnam vet, but she's at the point where she just doesn't see any other way out. So it's making me think I should do one more pass. Visual resources, because as Jack mentioned, documentaries and things like that. For like the more, and we're talking military sci-fi, action adventure, are there like movies or audio visuals or anything like if you need to see something, if you're not really a word person, you need to have like audio visual?
So yeah, this is huge. Documentaries of any kind that have reality to them are really important. And the one thing I can think of is it was really, really heartbreaking. And it shows how people really feel about war. And you can do this with just about any genre you're writing in, is the movie Restrepo. Restrepo is about the Kandahar Valley in Afghanistan, which was the most dangerous place in the world during the time this documentary was made. The filmmaker who made it, and I regret that I don't remember his name, but when you look it up, he actually died in a combat zone a few years later because he was in such dangerous areas making films. But there's this scene where the soldiers get ambushed and they get pinned down and they end up losing several soldiers. And you're right there. You see there's video footage of these people getting shot and killed. So it's not for the light of heart to watch this.
Yeah.
But there's this moment with the coffins when they're talking about the people that had died. You know, all the servicemen are there. They're back at base. They recovered the bodies. And the commander, and this dude is just huge. And he's like that classic puff chest hero. Like he is the epitome of this commander. And this is the thing that a lot of military sci-fi misses is they don't see this other side of it where everyone leaves and he's only there with his sergeant and he breaks down sobbing. It is real. This actually happens. And so that's the thing those are those little subtle touches that you need to take in to understand, like, where's the pain? Where's the humanity? Where's the hurt?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The emotional hook. Yeah.
This is a really good point. I got criticized by somebody, and you're going to get criticized. Like somebody's not going to like it, but I got criticized by someone for the romance that was in my military sci-fi because clearly they just didn't want to see that. But then I thought to myself, and I often get a lot more positive comments because of that. But it's like, what do you think kept these guys going in Vietnam? They had a picture of their girlfriend. They had a picture of their wife, you know?
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think there's, like, I have romantic subplots in my military sci-fi. It's not romance because it doesn't abide by romance tropes. And so there's a difference there, but some folks just don't like it. But if that's a part of what you're doing, you know, I think you just got to kind of own it. And absolutely, there's a certain element of realism to that. Absolutely.
Are there any cliches or tropes you would steer clear of? Like, my heroine, she's an alcoholic, but my dad was. So, but I worry that that's kind of cliche. But like, it's my experience. I mean,
it seems like that's an authentic thing. Is because when you talk about addiction of any kind, you're talking about covering pain. So I think the most thing is when you're going to have a trope like somebody's an alcoholic, you need to justify the pain that's underneath that. So when you talk about that, people will say like, yeah, I have that pain too. And I end up watching cat videos online because I'm like so depressed about the world. You know, they'll be able to relate and connect. And it's the pain underneath that people will connect to. And I think a lot of times when we talk about a trope, it's because it's thinly layered. It's just like, yep, he's an alcoholic and look at how trashed he is. But they never really justify why.
Okay. Right. Like, for example, my main character, boy, I don't want to talk too much about my own stuff here, but basically, he is unfaithful to his wife. And the way I had originally written the story, you were supposed to find out later that, like, she was being unfaithful too, and she was kind of abusive, but you didn't get to see it until much later. And I've realized I actually needed to show that pain first because everybody just hated my main character. because they didn't understand that he was all the pain that sent him down that path. And not that that's even necessarily the greatest example, but if you have a character who has something like that, which is a personality flaw or something about them that is unlikable. Like I think of House MD, the show, right?
100%, yeah.
Everybody's like, oh, well, he's a likable character, but he's an asshole.
Neat pothead, yeah.
But and you kind of get introduced to his backstory over time, but you come to realize this is his pain. That's why his physical, actual pain is why he's an asshole. That's where a lot of that comes from, and he's jaded for all these reasons, and it makes you like his character because you see how that could be you as well.
Yeah.
And if you don't do that work of showing the reader that, they're just going to think like your character is just an alcoholic because they're an alcoholic. There's no explanation. It doesn't have meaning behind it.
I just had this experience last week. I'm working on my current project is a sci-fi standalone that actually has some really dark themes. It involves human trafficking and sex work and a bunch of like really, really dark things. And so that the villains in that story are horrible people. And I found it really difficult to write these scenes. And Leah and I talked a little about it. I was like, hey, I need to watch my state of mind while I write these guys.
Yeah.
But then I worked on the backstory, this moment of exposition where you find out why this guy is so horrible. And the darkness of it just got deeper and deeper because I realized it's like, why do I feel so much darkness? Is because I'm connecting with this guy. Because we can all see it's like when we've been wounded hard enough, sometimes we'll do some bad things. And so when you can connect to a villain, God, that villain just gets really authentic and good.
Thank you for watching. Check out these other videos from BookFunnel, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.